Hi friends, I am very excited to introduce you to a new Evolving Leader mini-series called The Inner Canvas.
In these shows, our research colleagues, psychologist Emma Sinclair and neuroscientist Dr. Emily Clements, talk with pioneering scientists about new breakthroughs in our understanding of how we make sense of ourselves.
Yes, these will be fascinating conversations that will help our audience learn more about their mindset and why it matters.
And continue with their journey as evolving leaders.
Tune in for a powerful set of insights.
Hello, I'm Emma Sinclair.
And I'm Dr. Emily Clements.
And we're asking a new question of self-awareness, which is, how does your mind, brain and body create your experiences of the world? Are your experiences the same as everybody else's? Or does the way you think, feel and see become very unique for you? In this mini-series for Evolving Leader, myself and Emily cast a unique spin on how we understand ourselves, painting a picture of the internal canvas our mind creates. By bringing in guests who research unique aspects of our brain, we aim to open the science up to a wider audience and apply what we learn about our internal world to everyday life. So Emily, who are we speaking with in this episode?
In this episode, we give ourselves a reality check with Dr. Nadine Dijkstra. Nadine is going to introduce her research on the reality threshold, which is featured as one of the top 3 scientific breakthroughs in 2023. Nadine is a senior research fellow at University College London with a PhD in artificial intelligence and a background in experimental psychology. She now uses a multi-method approach, which includes brain scanning, machine learning, and computational modelling to answer questions such as, how do we keep apart what is real and what is imagined? The reason why we've brought Nadine onto this series is while the science behind the reality threshold is fundamental, the implications of the work are so much wider. If we can begin to understand that a lot of what we see in the world is constructed in our brains, we can better give ourselves that reality check and ask ourselves if our interpretation is really correct. This episode will take you through how our brains create visions and imagination, then how we can use this knowledge to gain more control over our lives and leadership, and how we might trick the reality threshold and our emotions for positive change. We end with a look to the future and how our sense of reality will be altered, for better or for worse, by artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and deepfakes. We hope you enjoy learning from Nadine as much as we do. Let's begin.
So can we dive into your research a little bit and understand it, perhaps for those of us who don't have a neuroscience degree or background, and maybe just understand, we've talked about this idea of the reality threshold. I don't know if that's where you want to start, but could you bring that to life for us and why that's so important to understand?
Yeah, so I think probably the better place to start is to think about mental imagery and imagination, what that is. So that's the topic that has been the topic of my research. So imagination is closing your eyes and picturing, for example, a beach or whatever, just the images that you can see in your mind's eye. That's what I talk about when I talk about imagination and mental imagery. And I really focus on the seeing aspect, but this also goes for, your mind's ear, the kind of music that you can hear in your mind. So we call it simulating sensory experiences, that you can kind of see and hear things in your mind. And during my PhD, I focused on to what extent we use the same parts of the brain when we imagine something as if we would see, as when we would see that same thing. So I asked people to look at a bunch of pictures and then to also imagine those same pictures while I measured their brain activity. And over the course of 4 years, I found that actually the brain does something very, very similar when you imagine something as when you actually see it. So that kind of begs the question, how then do we know what's real or imagined? Because your brain does not have access to the outside world, right? Your brain is trying to generate what you're seeing. It's trying to infer what you're seeing based on electricity, but it can't like directly know what's real or imagined. So the fact that your brain uses many of the same mechanisms to imagine as to see seems problematic. And that's where the reality threshold comes in, is okay, but then how do we keep the two apart? And do we always keep the two apart? And what happens when we don't? And we, for example, have hallucinations or delusions.
How have you found the reality threshold? What's the journey that's taken you to understanding that?
So I think the reality threshold is kind of this concept of the idea that the brain needs to keep the two apart. So thinking about, if you imagine something, many of the same brain areas become active. But then what is the threshold at which point the brain decides that activation represents reality? That's the idea of the reality threshold. So we talk specifically about the visual cortex, which is where your brain processes signals coming from your eyes. Your visual cortex also gets activated when you imagine something. So then at what point does the brain say, okay, this activation in the visual cortex tells me something about what's actually out there in the world, whereas this activation is only made up, basically. That's a very concrete example. And then the reality threshold would be, when does it count as reality according to your brain? When we imagine something, the brain does something very similar as when we see. You can also flip that around and say, actually, when we see something, your brain does something very similar as when you imagine something. So I think the idea here, where our work kind of relates to each other, is this idea that your brain is really actively creating your reality. And it's not just like a camera. It doesn't just kind of pick up what's out there, but it is actively filling in what you see based on your preconceptions and etc. And I think what that really highlights, and that's what consciousness research is also partly about, is that your experience of reality is very subjective. It's not very objective. And I think that's also where it can be important for leadership or any kind of interaction with other humans, is to realize that your version of reality is really the version that your specific unique brain creates. And that is very different to somebody else's brains.
Could you help us just bring to life the experiment that you ran and published last year to help us measure what we talk about when we have this concept of the reality threshold?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so what I did is I asked participants to imagine a very simple picture. In this case, it was diagonal lines. So they were just imagining diagonal lines while they were looking at this kind of white noise, TV static image. So they had to, with their eyes open, imagine diagonal lines in that white noise. And then what I also did sometimes, without the participants knowing, is I showed real diagonal lines in that noise as well at the same time. So you have imagined lines and real lines. And then I asked participants, okay, how vivid was your imagination? How clearly could you see those lines? And then I asked them, hey, actually, did you see any real lines presented on the screen? And then what we found was that when participants were imagining these lines really, really vividly, they were more likely to say that they saw real lines, even when there was nothing there. So sometimes I didn't show anything. So that basically shows that in some cases, participants mistook their very vivid imagination for reality. And what's really nice about this is we did some computational modeling, and then combined with what we know about the brain and how the brain processes imagination and reality, is a very easy way to explain this. Is the same brain areas get activated by imagery and perception, but it's about the strength of that activation, and that determines whether we think it's real or not. So if imagination is very, very vivid, very strong, then we can think it's real even when it's just imagined. But usually imagination is weaker, and then we can keep it apart from reality.
So I can imagine that must be like very different for different people. I think I mentioned it before the podcast, but I personally don't have hardly any mental imagery going on. Whereas Emma, for example, has really good mental imagery. So I'm just so curious to know, in people, when, if you tell them to close their eyes and use the kind of beach scene before, what would you expect to see in people that have different mental imagery abilities? What would you expect to see happening in their brains?
In their brains, yeah. So there's recently some research that is coming out on this. So there's a specific term for people who cannot see anything in their mind when they try to imagine something, and that's called aphantasia. So it's the absence of phantasms, so the absence of any visualization in your mind, basically. And there's some research that just came out last year and beginning of this year, and actually we can't really tell what the differences are yet. So there's some hints that maybe when people who don't have visualization, they rely more on their frontal cortex, which would suggest that perhaps they're just putting in more effort to try and see something, but it's just not really happening.
That feels like my experience.
Exactly, yeah. But then we all, like everybody expected that we would see differences in the visual cortex, because this is where, you know, we process what we see as well. So if you don't see anything when you imagine, perhaps the visual cortex is also not activated. But very surprisingly, is the visual cortex is still activated in people who say that they can't see anything in the mind's eye when they imagine. While they imagine. So it's a bit of a puzzle at this moment, actually. We don't really understand what's going on there. What we do seem to see is that perhaps people, and this is not in terms of the brain, but in terms of kind of confusions and behavior, is perhaps people with aphantasia are less likely to confuse imagery for perception because their experience of imagery is so different. And how that then works in the brain is the next question that we are still trying to figure out. But psychologically speaking, it seems that perhaps people with low vivid imagery are less likely to confuse the two. That's a current kind of.
So there's a positive to this.
That's a positive, yeah, exactly. I think so. So that's, you know, it might be a protective factor against things like psychosis or hallucinations. And another very recent, so again, this is all very, very recent research, so we need to be a bit careful about drawing firm conclusions. But there's one paper that suggests that people with aphantasia are less likely to have these traumatic re-experiences of a traumatic event that you see in PTSD. You know, in PTSD, people get these flashbacks. Maybe if you don't have any imagery, you don't get these flashbacks because you can't see it in your mind. So,
can I ask on that, where the question came from for your research? What is it that you're sort of posing in terms of why this is important? I mean, it's, you know, Harvard is a breakthrough of last year, so congratulations on that. I'm just really fascinated. What's the research question behind it for you?
So the research question is how can we imagine things? How can we see things in our mind? And then, you know, building onto that, finding out that we use very similar mechanisms as actual seeing. How do we keep the two apart? How does the brain keep the two apart? It's unclear now. And it seems like such a fundamental question, right? Like, how do we keep our internal world like separated from the external world? It goes quite deep, I think. And I think it's quite surprising that we don't know that yet. We just don't know. So that's the research question.
And how is this, where are you seeing this helping people? You mentioned before, like perhaps in schizophrenia or hallucination. What's the sort of applied element of this could you see with down the line?
Yeah, I think there's a few different directions we could take it in. So I am a fundamental researcher, so I'm mostly just interested in the fundamental mechanisms at the start. But eventually, I think figuring out how the brain usually is able to keep apart imagination and reality will tell us what might go wrong when that doesn't work anymore, such as in psychosis. So we are currently repeating the experiment that you mentioned from last year in a much larger group of people. And then we are also measuring their psychosis and hallucination proneness in these people with questionnaires. And then the question would be, do we see that people who are more likely to experience hallucinations in daily life, for example, that they sometimes see things that aren't there, these kinds of experiences, do those people also have higher confusions between imagery and perception in our experiment? That's something we're looking into now.
I know your research is a lot in visual imagery, but you're also talking about auditory hallucinations. But I think one of the things that interests me in this is if you can start to tease apart and understand how the brain distinguishes between what is real and what is imagined, how much impact that could have in terms of just understanding us and like speaking about kind of how we construct our own realities and, you know, our own stories that we tell ourselves. And, you know, when two people are in a situation and they leave that situation and they have a completely different view of what happens, because we just create this own story and narrative in our head that fits maybe sometimes also what we're projecting onto a situation and what we're expecting.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, do you think, like, I know the core mechanisms for your work is this kind of visual imagery, but do you think really underneath it, this ability to look at what the brain is doing when something's real is imagined could then be kind of translated to a lot of different areas in our lives, like our beliefs, our experiences?
Yeah, for sure. I really do think that. So the way that I and other people think about it is there's a hierarchy of complexity in terms of how we build up our model of reality. So for example, if I am interacting with you, then the first level is the sensory or the perceptual level, which is what I see and hear. And that's what my research taps into. But then above that is what I think you think about our interaction, what I believe your intentions are, what the context is. And you can go like more and more abstract in terms of, you know, higher order beliefs is what we call them. And this is what you're talking about. And the idea would be that if at the first level of just what we see, if already at that point things are more subjective than we like to think, then it's only going to be exaggerated at higher levels, right? It's only going to like add up and becomes more and more subjective. So, I think inferring other people's intentions is a good example, because that is very subjective. And if you know, I don't even hear what you're saying. If I already kind of fill in what you're saying, just in terms of literal words that you are uttering, if I'm already like changing that based on my preconceptions, then the meaning of those words, I'm only gonna like go further and further away. Does that make sense? It's a bit of an abstract concept.
Absolutely, yeah. And I loved the that hook for me was the fact that even if that what we consider as our very kind of like the sensory perceptual, like what you see, what you hear, as that very baseline senses, and everything else on top of that is more complicated. If we are considering that even that is constructed, so even that can kind of alter depending on your own experiences. So for example, even just the fact that I don't have like mental imagery, you guys do. Yeah. Like in a conversation, if someone was describing something quite visual, the experiences that we have in those conversations just going to be so different.
Exactly, 100%. So in terms of individual differences, I think there's going to be, massive effects there. And another area that I think is quite interesting that people have just started to explore is that individual differences in imagery vividness also seem to be related to individual differences in perceptual sensitivity. So if your imagination is very, very, very vivid, you might also be more sensitive to things in the environment. So you might see things that other people don't see. You might hear things that other people don't hear. So this goes quite far, I think.
What are you currently doing at the moment for your research? What research studies are you running? I think you might have mentioned you're doing some brain imaging at the moment.
Yeah, so I actually, I'm really excited about this because I'm doing two things. The brain imaging is something that I'm just finishing some analysis on. So it's basically our study that we did, the behavioral study. We now also did it in the brain scanner. And then, so I seem to have found the regions that code for the reality threshold. So that's really exciting. So that's something that we're looking into now. And another thing that we're doing is actually use brain stimulation. So that's a transcranial magnetic stimulation, which alters the electrical field of your brain. And the idea is that if the main difference between imagery and perception is really the strength of these signals, what happens if you increase the strength of these signals with brain stimulation while people are imagining? Do they then think it's real? That's the question. That's the study that we're running really now as well. So we'll see.
So you pinpointed the areas or the networks that you think are responsible for, and that's kind of for us being able to say that's real, that's not.
Yeah, and now we're zapping them with the brain stimulation to see if that changes it. Yeah.
How do you do that on people? What What do you use to zap it? Just so people who don't know what it is can understand.
Yeah, so it's called TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it's basically a magnetic field that's interacting with the magnetic field of the electrical current in your neurons. And it's a very safe, kind of non-invasive way to change your brain activity. It's like a H-shaped kind of coil that you just push on somebody's head, and then you send some current, and then that changes your brain activity. This is a technique that's also used to treat depression. It's quite safe.
Nice. Yeah. And so what do you think the potential benefits of it could be if you can zap people's reality threshold? We can tell them, yep, this is real now, or this is imagined.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, in like maybe 10 or 20 years, if we can do that, maybe we can change it for good for people with psychosis, and we can, maybe their reality threshold is just miscalibrated, and maybe we can recalibrate it with our brain stimulation. That would be amazing, right? So that's one potential application in the future.
Where is your research taking you next?
So I think this reality threshold is really like a concept now. It's a concept based on one behavioral study. So we really need to investigate more how this is implemented in the brain, which factors all influence it, what are the individual differences, how does this affect things like hallucinations, psychosis, PTSD? Is it, related to just general perception? There's so many questions that come from just this basic, simple concept. So that's, lots to do, lots to do still. The role of emotion as well, very important.
This gets me sort of quite fascinated to think about how you take that into leadership or even into team environments where, if you work on a base assumption that we're all seeing the same thing. And I know, studies and have been shown that people do see different things, obviously. But I mean, how do you even start a conversation around that? I don't know if that came up in any of your research in terms of how people just made it okay to say, well, I'm definitely not seeing what you're seeing there. And is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the things that I love about it is we don't talk about it. So we assume that everybody's experience is similar. But then, for example, aphantasia, which is this like complete lack of visualization. People don't realize this until they're like 30, 40 years old. And then they're like, wait, you can see things in your mind? They're so surprised that other people can see these things. So I think it's exactly something that we don't talk about. And then I think in terms of like collaboration and any kind of interaction with others, it's just good to check your assumptions. Like if you're going to make important decisions about what you think somebody else thinks, then maybe just ask, just check. Because there's a good chance that you're wrong, I think.
Just thinking about that different internal canvas that people have going on and how that affects people in interactions. Do you, with your research kind of on it, do you find yourselves at all in your work or in your life kind of using the understanding, I guess, that you've gained from your research in the way that you interact with people?
No, 100%. I think in terms of checking assumptions, I think that's a really good example. Like I mentioned before, I think we're all very quick to assume that others think similarly as we do. And, my research and just research in this area in general has really shown to me that that's not true in many circumstances. So yeah, I think I'm much more like I'm a very direct communicator. I just really ask. I think being Dutch also maybe plays a role in that, but I think just knowing that, everybody's interpretation of a specific situation is so subjective, I think that makes me always really want to check, especially when it's important.
Why can we imagine as human beings? What does that enable for us?
One thing that we're thinking about is maybe the conscious visualization aspect is important for generating an emotional response. That's something that we've been thinking about. So there's some research that shows that if you can imagine something very, very vividly, then the emotion associated with that experience is also stronger.
Yeah, that connection is the thing that I guess I'm trying to understand. I would love to from that, the concepts of how and why you might imagine. So I could see it in a sporting environment, obviously, and a lot of coaching is in that space, imagining the imagining winning, imagining being at the end line. The same is done in, thinking about visions for organizations, 5 years, 10 years, and then working back from that future end state. And I'm just recognizing now, even working with leaders, that if you've got a group of leaders who can do that and it becomes very vivid, and to your research, sometimes the imagination is so vivid that you physically can see it, and then you've got a group who can't, it just begs the question, how do you start from, why start from a place of imagination? Is it the place to start? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, the question is really like, how important is the seeing aspect?
Yes.
Because you can kind of think about a future, right, without actually seeing it, right? If that makes sense. Like you can okay, where do you want to be in 5 years, and you can like give a verbal description of what that would be, but that doesn't mean you actually see yourself there. And my intuition is the same as yours, that seeing yourself there makes you more motivated and makes you feel it more. But we don't know.
Connection to the emotion sounds like that's the next route.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that'll
be 2024's breakthrough, I can guarantee.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
I guess what I'd like to know is if, say, someone listening to this episode is listening and understanding about the reality threshold, understanding the things we've spoken about. So the fact that it, are even things that we're imagining are kind of constructed, but even our reality is constructed, thinking about how this might play into how we interact with other people. And then also, as Emma was speaking kind of about our visions of the future, what could someone gaining understanding about the reality threshold do for them personally in terms of understanding themselves a bit more and helping them?
So this is all going to be hat wavy, and as a scientist I don't like it, but I'm just going to preface it, and then I'll say that this is all just my speculation and we need more research, but the way that I harness my own imagination, which is similar to what Emma mentioned, is to kind of trick my brain into creating a specific reality. Because if we know that your brain responds very similarly, so you can kind of decide what your reality looks like by imagining it that way. If you're constantly imagining bad things, if you're constantly imagining, a hard future or scary things, then your brain is going to feel like that's real. You're going to feel like that's real. So your whole perspective of the world and your whole experience is going to be negative. But you can also harness that the other way. So you can, imagine positive things and imagine good things. And then that is also going to be the lens through which you see the world. I think that's something that is quite powerful. And I think there's a lot of like self-help and stuff that already, focuses on that. But we can back that up with neuroscience, because you can just trick your brain that's true.
How does our mind play tricks on us in that respect?
All the time. I mean, we've all obviously, I assume, but most people have experienced anxiety, right? And when you're anxious, everything is scary. You see everything negatively. You see danger everywhere. And none of that is real, right? I think that's a very clear example. And then when you're really anxious and you're, driving in a dark road at night, you might see like scary people in the bushes everywhere. But again, none of that's real. That's just your brain creating a reality that fits with your perspective of the world. But you can flip that around as well. And it's hard because it requires a lot of kind of self-awareness and reflection and realizing that your brain is playing tricks on you, realizing that it's not real. I think a lot of, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, goes into that, is, seeing your thoughts for what they are, which is just thoughts and, interpretations, not reality, and then trying to flip that around. Yeah.
So when could this become like almost a, I hate the phrase, but I'm going to use it because it makes sense, almost like a superpower in some respects? Because you're really touching on that idea of it being part of your core self-awareness. Now, what I don't want to do is suggest that everybody walks out there and questions whether they really are seeing a table in front of them, and we become all very existential. But,
no, I don't think.
like what's that kind of question you should ask yourself in the moments, as you said, maybe it's an area of uncertainty, or a moment where you actually want to ask, like, what am I actually seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, you can just ask, is this real?
Okay.
Right? You could, that.
Is this
that's
real?
Fine. Yeah, I think that would work. And I think, in interpersonal relationships, this is also a big thing, right? You assume somebody has really bad intentions, or you can just check, is this real? Maybe not, and then you can ask and check and do other checks to
Guess that's the reality check that you do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, is this...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this we already know from psychology and from other areas of research, but I think, the neuroscience now is really showing how far this actually goes. I think,
And
that's the way I see it.
As you were like kind of speaking about anxiety and like seeing threats in the dark, I just started to think, do you think in some ways, are most people's brains set up to almost have the negative construction, to see the threat, to see is that the survival mechanism? And is twisting that to create a more positive, constructive reality, is that the work? Is that harder? Or, I mean, we all know some people who are just like so optimistic. Like, were they born with it? Like, how hard do you think it is? And do you think it is like that's the kind of tendency for most people to go a bit more negative?
Yeah, again, this is not my area of expertise, so this is a bit of speculation. But that's what I would think as well, indeed, that, for survival mechanisms or survival reasons, it makes more sense to notice when things are bad and to have a little bit of a bias of noticing things that could potentially be dangerous. And, the things that are positive and keep you safe don't really add any information for your survival chances. But it does make you feel better. So especially in our, modern society where there's no lions lurking everywhere, it might be helpful to try, flip that perspective a little bit. But yeah, I would assume that is less automatic and requires more effort. Yeah.
And I guess so I'm thinking, so like to bring it back to your, visual, actually what you're seeing. So I feel like a lot of people have situations where they're, say, in a conversation with someone and they think, oh, they looked pissed off with me, or they looked like, do you think there's an element of sometimes that kind of constructed reality come in if we're in a certain kind of mood, thinking
100%.
We're seeing certain emotions on people's faces who maybe it's not even there?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally. So in terms of emotions, that's a really clear one. But even, if you have a slightly ambiguous picture, that's then research that I'm more aware of. If you have a slightly ambiguous picture and you expect to see one thing, you're going to see that thing. And if you expect to see something else, you're going to see that other thing, even though the picture is the same. So it's, your expectations, your view, it really influences what you see. Yeah.
I'm gonna take us into something else, just in terms of this crossover between reality and imagination, and where most recently with some of the emerging topics we shared with you beforehand, this is becoming harder potentially for us as human beings. And one is the rise of AI. And when we were thinking about this from a visual perspective, obviously deepfake became something that we were considering. And I think we just posed this question, like, how can we trust what we see? Like, how is this affecting your thinking and the work that you're doing as well?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And the way I think about this is that my research is going to show, hopefully, what the brain uses to decide what's real or not. And then maybe we can say, okay, those are also the things that we use when we evaluate whether a deep fake is real or not. But that doesn't actually help us in actually, the truth of whether it's real or fake, right? Because I think, as the technology advances, that's just going to be almost impossible, unfortunately, especially if you just have video material, whether you don't know whether that's a recorded video or a generated video. I don't think there's any, as if it's really good, I don't think there's anything that would distinguish the two, because it's just, video material in both cases. Yeah.
And I guess like what you're saying is not in our brains. Like we might have to have software that is able to then detect it, but it's because what we see, we like with your reality threshold, I guess the signal when we're watching this video is strong enough that we are going to perceive that as,
I think so
real.
Too. Yeah. I think so. I think we do also use other cues. So if the quality of the video is good, yes, but we will also maybe check if it makes sense. So a good example, if we suddenly see a video of a human flying, we're probably going to think it's a deep fake because humans don't fly. right? So like those kinds of things of, our background knowledge about the laws of the universe will also influence whether we think something is real or imagined, or real or fake. But yeah, if the technology is good enough.
That's interesting kind of in itself, though, in terms of, because if we have certain models and belief systems, say if it was, I don't know, if deepfake was used for kind of political agendas or whatever, like, if you have a certain view and you see a kind of constructed video, some people would see it and think, oh, that's not real. And other people might kind of perceive that as real.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that's probably what's going to happen then. Yeah.
Kind of brings me to that very simple question that you asked in terms of how you how you can stop playing tricks on yourself as such, which is this real? And that sounds, I didn't dismiss it, but I didn't really think about it as such an important question until you then bring that into the reality. And as Emily said, if you've got two groups of people watching a deep fake video and, essentially arguing about the future and policy around those, then the question really is actually we need to bring that into our own awareness of, well, what is reality, and how do we question that in the future? That takes us into a completely different realm of leadership and beyond.
100%. And I think realizing how subjective our initial experience is will hopefully also, motivate us to actually do this reflecting, to make this extra step, not just assume and not just, take the information at face validity, but actually think about it. There's actually some really interesting research from my collaborator, Professor Steve Fleming. He's a professor in metacognition or self-awareness is the research. And he has shown that people with more dogmatic views, both sides of the political spectrum, but just the more extreme the views are, the lower the metacognition, so the lower the self-awareness, which intuitively makes sense, right? So if you go very extreme, then probably you're just not reflecting on things very much anymore.
And for people who aren't familiar with metacognition, can you give like a definition of what is metacognition in our brain?
Yeah, so metacognition is thinking about thinking. So that's quite broad, as it can be reflecting on whether what you see is accurate or not. So that's the area where I'm looking into, but also whether what you remember actually happened or not, was accurate, or when you're doing revising for an exam, whether your knowledge is good enough or not. So it's just kind of reflecting on your own cognitive abilities or cognitive processes.
So how does this metacognitive kind of ability that some people have, and it can be kind of higher in some people and lower in some people, is that right? So how does that interact with our reality threshold? So when we're trying to perceive if something is kind of real or it's imagined, what's that metacognition able to do for us?
So again, we don't know. So the way that Steve and me are thinking about this is that you use the same mechanisms, or partly the same mechanisms. So and we call this perceptual metacognition. That is how well you know how accurate your perception is. And then we're kind of adding a dimension to that, saying, okay, that perceptual metacognition is not only saying how accurate your perception is, but it's also saying whether your perception is real or imagined. It's like adding another factor to it. But this is going really into the nitty-gritty of the science, I think.
Yeah, I tend to go deeper into that, so I'll hand it back over to Emma to bring us back to reality.
So what happens then, Nadine? I'm just going to take you to another route. What happens when we do have something that definitely feels real, but we know it isn't real because we are, so I'm thinking virtual reality. We put a headset on. We know it's not real, but in all intents and purposes, it feels ridiculously real when you're in it. Like, how are we making sense of that world?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot as well. And it also reminds me of things like lucid dreaming. I don't know if you,
Explain that for
people,
everyone there, if you don't mind. That'd be great.
So people, a lucid dream, and most people experience one or two in their lifetime or a couple, but some people have it more regularly. It's when you're dreaming and you kind of wake up in your dream, but you're still dreaming. So you're still in your dream world, but you realize that you're dreaming. So you're aware that you're dreaming. So you know it's not real, but it still feels real. So what a lot of people do, including me, is they start flying, because that's amazing. And you can just fly in your dream, and you're like flying and you're experiencing and you feel it. So your emotions are in line with what you're experiencing, but you know that this is you just dreaming. So there seems to be a distinction between kind of experiencing something as real in virtual reality in dreams and knowing that it's real, which is like a higher level. So we think about it as a higher level, this belief level that we talked about, whereas the first level is the kind of perceptual, experiential level, and then the belief or the knowledge is the higher level. And, again, something we still need to investigate a lot of, and we're still kind of at the first steps into that research. Probably there's going to be different brain mechanisms that track both of those, and they interact. So usually when something feels real, you're going to think it's real, but sometimes they can decouple.
I know this is really dystopian, but it's making me think about, when they talk about the kind of like future of AI and how it could solve like loneliness and all these problems. And I'm just wondering how, even if you had these kind of super intelligent systems that people could kind of socially interact with, and it could give them a lot of that like comfort and reassurance, and even say like ChatGPT, you can talk to it, ask it for advice. I wonder for humans what's going to be going on with this. Like, okay, we might be able to experience things as like a real conversation with a human, but if we know it's not a human, like what that does for us.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know, honestly, because I think the emotions are mostly driven by the first level, the perceptual, experiential level. At least that's my intuition. Again, we don't know. But, if you're in a virtual reality environment and it's very realistic and you suddenly see a lion, you're going to be scared, right? Your initial response is going to be, your body, your cortisol is going to go up, your whole fight or flight is going to go on, turn on, even though this is just simulated. And the same is what you see with imagination, is when you imagine something very vividly, it still feels like you still have the same emotion. So in AI, if it feels real to us, a social interaction, it might give us the same sense of belonging as an actual human does. But I don't know, again, more research is needed, but yeah,
I wonder as well, like, I think whenever we talk about AI, we always go to the kind of the negative side of it. But do you think there's kind of potential in terms of like you were saying, that actually the emotions happen at this experiencing level? So when we are perceiving something and experiencing it, even if we don't know it's real, it could have a kind of emotional impact. Do we think there's kind of potential benefits for, say, using something like VR and that ability to kind of trick our reality threshold? Could that be used for good? Is it being used for good at the moment?
Yeah, 100%. So I think there's a few different examples of VR, for example, for therapy. Exposure therapy is one example, where you don't need a real spider, but you can just have a VR headset of a spider. If somebody who has a fear of spiders, then you can treat them by creating a virtual reality environment where you show a spider, and it's all a bit more controlled and it's a bit less intense, and then you can kind of use that and build up the intensity in a very controlled way. So I think that's a good example. Another one is training for surgery. Might be good not to have an actual human when you haven't done that before. So then being able to do that in a virtual reality environment really, helps. So I think those are there's some, or like military training is what it's used for as well. Where again, you can create really real life or like lifelike scenarios that are actually not real, but still help you to get, used to the emotions that kind of situation would bring up, and help you to navigate that.
What your research really highlights to me, and kind of as you spoke about, is just it brings that awareness of the fact that so much is constructed, and that we do have this kind of balance going on in our brain of what is real and what is imagined. And I think the science is really, really valid, and it's based in real, like, hardcore neuroscience, but it can really bring up a lot of self-awareness questions for people. And to me personally, that's why I was very excited to have you on the show. And I just think the work you're doing is absolutely amazing. And I'm really looking forward to seeing, you probably want to keep it under wraps now until it's published, but I'm excited to see, what parts of the brain are creating our reality, and whether we can change this.
It's hopefully going to come out in a few months, so keep an eye out.
I have learned an awful lot, and that question of what is real is something that I'm going to put back up the top of a list of things to start to experiment with over the course of the next few weeks. Awesome. And just see what comes up for me personally. I think with that question, I think it's a great one. So thank you, Nadine. Really, really appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please take a moment to like and comment on Apple or Spotify. Our goal with this show is to make these ideas accessible, helping each of us to have better, more committed, and more human leadership. And if we've helped you with any of these shows, please help us by sharing your experience so we can amplify our efforts. And remember, the world is evolving. Are you?